you could just as easily draw on, I believe it's Helen Fisher, who or other feminist evolutionary biologists who make the case that women are best served by adultery because they're getting a good range of sperm, and the best suited sperm is the sperm that's going to win.
That does account for cheating behavior, and most of the evolutionary psychologists who have their act together take that into account. Is that what the optimal strategy, if you're being cold-hearted about it biologically, especially for a woman who hasn't optimized her mate choice, might be to find someone stable and second rate and then to cheat sporadically to produce that biological diversity. And that does seem to be something approximating a stable biological solution, even though I don't think it's an optimal one. So
right. Well,
I think the sophisticated evolutionary psychologists have taken that into account.
Gotcha. But let me just speak to why that kind of very beloved, and I have to notice that it's beloved, of the whole kind of, Dawkins crowd, the whole selfish gene crowd is it kind of loves this idea of the young, fertile female who needs to find that unattractive, older, wealthy man who happen to be a scientist, and also accounts for or always gives males a kind of, well, you're just polygamous or you just need lots of sexual partners and it's good for the reproduction of the race or the species. So the reason I find these tendentious and especially, this notion of women optimizing the material value of their partner to make up for their reproductive deficits is that respectfully, it's out of date. And what I mean by that is I totally concede that, women, it's hard to be pregnant. It's hard to have a baby. It puts you at a disadvantage. Certainly, it's not accounted for in, contemporary work expectations, more so since the pandemic when everyone's at home. But, when you had to go to work, obviously it's put women at a disadvantage and they needed a provider for those 2 years. But I will say that now I think that young men, for instance, like a whole phenomenon that I find fascinating. I might find it fascinating as an older woman who's married a much younger man, but I find it fascinating that when I was writing The Beauty Myth, older women were considered done reproductively or sexually. And now that's no longer the case. And that there's this whole kind of expectation now of young men finding older women who are materially successful and who can, provide them with a good lifestyle, really attractive. So I think that the evolutionary biologists haven't accounted for that. Even women past reproductive age who are financially successful are considered really attractive to young men now. So that's a 21st century phenomenon. It never used to exist. And the other thing that didn't used to exist is if women have enough material resources now, they can hire someone. And I'm not saying this is optimal. It's very sad. I'm with you on the value of the nuclear family. But, if they haven't married someone who can look after them for that brief window when a baby and, a nursing baby is impeding your ability to kind of go it on your own. Totally agree with that. They can hire someone to help with those 2 years. So really the penalties for being a single mom, it's not easy. If you don't have resources, I completely concede you're going to kind of go down the socioeconomic scale. But if you do have resources, that's no longer the case. And that's why you're seeing, so much of what you criticize, 21st century economic opportunities have made it possible to be an affluent single mom, hire a caregiver, hire, someone to help you raise the baby, basically when the baby's tiny. And then starting from 3 years old, there are childcare centers, daycare centers that will take the baby. And so I think the evolutionary biologists haven't accounted for what is going to result from that. It's what we've seen result from it, which is, I'm sorry to be rude, but the value of men has gone down. And I think that respectfully, that's one of the things I think is most useful about your work. Respectfully, I've been thinking about this. I think that's why you've been so targeted by the establishment, is that you talk about the value of men and you talk about, how men can be relevant and consider themselves to be relevant and have a role in 21st century society. So I think the great unspoken or underanalyzed phenomenon of the 21st century is the deconstruction of the value of men which completely upends the evolutionary biologist's kind of narrative about men and women. And, respectfully, to kind of end on a happy note, I do think the value of your work is that you're trying to give men, and succeeding in a lot of ways, a role in 21st century society in which they do have value, but it's not
Well,
going to
one
be
of
the
the
same value
one
they had before women could go it
well,
alone.
it's an interesting that's an interesting subtopic because I've insisted to my viewers and listeners who are disproportionately male on the YouTube front, mostly because YouTube is disproportionately male. It's about 75-25. And so I don't differ from that much, by the way. In fact, I think I have more female viewers than average by that baseline standard. I mean, I've suggested to my young male viewers continually that if they're rejected by all women out of hand, that they have to take that burden onto themselves and not assume that all the women are wrong, and that what they should strive to do, well, the probability that you're right and 4 billion people are wrong is 1 in 4 billion. It's rather low. And so you have to take that as a brute fact in some sense. And it might be unfair in that women, like men, use a set of criteria that you could describe as arbitrary in some sense to make their judgments. But there's some things you're not going to win an argument against, and that's definitely one of them. But one of the things I've suggested to young men is that if they concentrated on making themselves productive and generous, that the probability that that will increase their ability to find a mate is extraordinarily high. And I do think that's the case, and that advantage accrues as men mature. So what do you think of that as attack? I mean,
I want to thank you for my marriage, because you are my husband's. He said, "Tell him he's my spirit animal." You are one of my husband's kind of role models, and he listened to you. And so, unlike other men of his generation, he was all about like picking up the check and being a provider, and it's really attractive. So 100%, I agree with you.
why was it attractive? Why was it attractive? Why was it
Well,
attractive to you?
so now I'm going to throw a little bit of a wrench in your argument. It was attractive to me because everyone likes someone who is competent enough to, make money, I guess, at whatever level they're making money. It shows that they're not a feckless, immature, dependent person. And everyone likes someone who can look after them. But what I'm going to add there is that I think men like women who can look after them too. And I think men like women who are competent too. And I think just like it's sexy when a man picks up a check, it's sexy when a woman picks up a check, in due course. And I've heard plenty of men say, well, I took her out 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times and she never made a gesture to pick up the check. And that's not attractive because women,
I think that's the attractiveness of reciprocity. Is one of the things you really do want in a partner over the long run. And there's probably nothing more important than this in a business relationship or a friendship or an intimate relationship, is that fundamentally the relationship, to be self-sustaining, has to be reciprocal. And that doesn't mean that everybody gets obsessive about making sure that the distributions are 50-50, because they really should be 75-75, right? If you're in a productive relationship, both of you are, what you both receive is more than the sum total of what you both contribute, right? If you optimize the relationship. And I think part of the reason that men will appreciate women who pick up a check is not necessarily because it's an indication of their competence, although I think that's part of it. I think it is definitely an indication of their willingness and ability to reciprocate, which is fundamentally. Now, I don't know, and I don't know of any research that pertains specifically to that issue.
Right. But I guess what I'm saying, to jump in, is that I think your analysis and the evolutionary biologist's analysis is productively updated by this reality, which is fairly new, that both genders are surveilling the landscape for people who are, not only sexually and reproductively attractive, but who will reciprocate, who will take care of them, who can provide, who are not dependent. And I do think that the kind of woman who was considered very sexy in the 60s when I was a child is no longer considered sexy because she's not able to contribute to the household. That doll-like, what is her name? Twiggy-like, inert, voiceless person. I mean, men who are competent may kind of give it a passing admiring glance or have a one-night stand with her, but I don't think that has a high value any longer as a life partner.
Do you think that's a historical transformation, or do you think it's more a return to something approximating eternal norm? Because here's something interesting. For example, the name Eve, the original Hebrew term for the name Eve, which unfortunately I can't remember at the moment,
Chava.
means beneficial adversary.
Really?
And so, yes, it does. It does. And there's a notion there that the person who's the most well matched to you as a potential partner is not someone who passively submits to your demands, partly because your demands might be unreasonable and pathological, and that's not good for you or them, but someone who's capable of engaging you in something like a provocative and challenging reciprocal play. Like if you pick a play partner in a game, one-on-one basketball, for example, you're not going to pick someone that you can easily dominate if you have any sense, because it's not any fun. What you really want is someone who can spar with you at the limit of your ability. And that's a strange way of conceptualizing a relationship, but it's not strange if you know anything about how people engage in the processes that lead to further learning, for example, or the expansion of skill, is you're looking for the edge of optimal competition. And I think there were periods of time, and the Victorian period in England that you described might have been one of them, where the female ideal is tilted more towards one of passivity. And that might have been a reaction, as you pointed out, to the increased agitation on the female front for a broader role in the public polity. But it isn't obvious to me that historically speaking, the feminine ideal has been passive.